Hello, boys and girls. And one more time, we're about to read with Mrs. Gordon. Today's book is entitled Harriet Tubman, The Union Spy by Jerry Cipriano. This story is about Harriet Tubman and her role in leading slaves to freedom along the Underground Railroad. Chapter 1, A Dangerous Mission. 3 war boats sailed down the river. The boats carried 150 black soldiers who once had been slaves. They were making a sneak attack on the enemy in South Carolina. It was a dangerous job. The enemy had put underwater bombs in the river. At any moment, a gunboat would blow up. The soldiers had to surprise the enemy. They had to destroy bridges and supplies before enemy soldiers could fight back. The boats moved quietly in the fog. Slaves saw the gunboats and became scared. They started moving away from the river. Then one boat moved closer to the shore. A tiny person stood on deck and started singing. The slaves stopped moving away. They knew that song. They recognized the voice as a call to freedom. Suddenly, hundreds of slaves turned and ran for the river. Women ran with babies in their arms. Children hung onto their skirts, and hundreds of slaves, young and old, splashed into the water. They couldn't swim, but they would make a break for freedom or die trying. Soldiers worked quickly. They kept pulling slaves up into the boats. They had to make a quick getaway, and they did. The mission was a success. The gunboats carried more than 700 slaves north. In the North, they would no longer be slaves. They would live as free people. Harriet, the conductor. Who was the brain behind this bold mission? Who planned the attack? Who chose the troops and trained them? The leader was a top war spy from the United States government. Her name was Harriet Tubman. Harriet had a lot of spy experience. She had led slaves to freedom long before the Civil War broke out. Harriet was a conductor of the Underground Railroad. Spy moves. Sometimes Harriet wore disguises for trips. She might dress as a man or an old woman. Tubman always met the slaves on Saturday nights. This would give them a head start. Newspapers did not print lists of runaway slaves until Monday morning. The Underground Railroad was the code name for people who helped slaves travel secretly to the north to become free. The work was top secret. Conductors sent secret messages to slaves in different ways. One way was through songs. Posters like this one were put up all around the area when slaves ran away. Many offered a reward for their capture. Harriet made 19 trips back to her home state of Maryland. On each trip, she protected her baggage. Baggage was the secret code name for slaves who was escaping to freedom. Harriet reached these slaves through song. Her call to meet her was the song Go Down Moses. If she sung slowly, the coast was clear. It was safe for the slaves to run to her in the deep woods. But if she sang loudly and quickly, she was given a warning, go back, you are being followed and it is not safe. The journeys were very dangerous. Sometimes slave catchers with dogs would follow the runaways. Harriet knew safe stops during the route. A safe house was where people fed the slaves and let them rest. Sometimes they hid the slaves if slave catchers were too close. Harriet's first trip was in 1850. She worked as a conductor for 10 years. She led 70 slaves to freedom and no one was ever captured. Harriet Tubman, dead or alive. In the late 1850s, slave owners offered a $40,000 reward for catching Harriet Tubman. Back then, $40,000 was equal to $1 million today. One day, she overheard some men reading her wanted poster, which stated that she was illiterate or unable to read. So Harriet picked up a book and pretended to read it. The trick was enough to fool the men. The Underground Railroad was active for 10 years. It stopped when the Civil War broke out in 1861. More than 1,000 slaves escaped to freedom through the Underground Railroad. Chapter 2, War breaks out. The United States went to war in 1861. It was a war like no other. This war was called the Civil War because U.S. citizens fought each other. What caused neighbors to fight? The main reason was slavery. Southern states had slaves working on large farms called plantations. They wanted to keep slaves as slaves. Northern states had just voted with President Lincoln to end slavery. Harriet goes to war. When the Civil War broke out, Harriet joined the Union Army. She wanted to help free all slaves in the North and the South. In 1862, Harriet went to Beaufort, South Carolina, to be a nurse. That is where Harriet met Colonel James Montgomery. Here you see a Union Army soldier and a Confederate Army soldier, boys and girls. Montgomery saw that Harriet made a good spy. He trusted her to plan and lead the attack on the Combahee River in 1863. He also counted on her to find, train, and work with other spies. Harriet knew that slave women would make great spies. Owners did not think slave women mattered. They did not pay attention to them. Owners did not think that slave women knew anything. Most slave women could not read or write, so owners talked freely in front of slave women. They told each other secrets in front of the women. But slave women heard everything. They saw everything. They remembered everything. The slave women told Harriet what they heard and saw. They told her where soldiers hid along the Combahee River. They told her where to find the underwater bombs. Harriet the Spy. Harriet became the first woman in American history to lead troops into combat. She used many tricks she had learned on the Underground Railroad. Harriet often wore disguises. She also learned to be in the right place at the right time. Once she dressed as an old woman and went to a police building. The police were holding a runaway slave. They would be sending that slave back to the South to his or her owner. A large crowd of black people gathered outside the police building. From a window, the old black woman gave a hand signal. The crowd ran into the building. They fought with the police and freed the runaway slave. People say Harriet Tubman was the old woman. She was really a very young woman at the time. Later during the war, the Union Army asked Harriet to find and train black men as spies. She became head of the whole information getting business. She also led raids into slave territories. She persuaded slaves to leave their masters. Then Harriet helped them join troops of black soldiers as fighters and nurses. Women secret warriors. In the mid-1800s, American women were second-class citizens. They had no legal rights. They couldn't vote. They couldn't work at the same jobs as men. So women found ways to be treated equally. They disguised themselves as men. They would do men's jobs and earn men's pay too. During the Civil War, close to 1,000 women disguised themselves as men and joined the armies. Soldiers who joined the Union Army, got $152 just for joining. That was half the yearly salary of most workers. Soldiers got regular pay too. Not all women joined armies to better themselves. Many joined to fight side by side with their husbands. Chapter 3. Harriet Tubman, the early years. Nurse, cook, spy, fearless leader. How did Harriet Tubman come to be all these things? What was her life as a young child growing up? Harriet Tubman was born into slavery around 1822 on a plantation near Bucktown, Maryland. She was named Araminta, or Minty for short. She was the fifth of 9 children of Harriet Ritt Green and Benjamin Ross. Both were slaves. Harriet was whipped daily as a little girl. She had to work in icy cold water setting muskrat traps. Life was hard, and one day the master sold 3 of her sisters. Harriet never saw them again. Harriet was hired out to do different masters. Some were very cruel. When she was about 12 years old, Harriet was hit in the head with an iron weight. The blow broke her skull. The injury caused her problems the rest of her life. She would fall asleep at any time and any place. When she was older, Harriet was hired out to the shipbuilder. She showed great strength and energy working like a man. The owner agreed to let Harriet hire herself out. She paid him a yearly fee of $60 to work for herself. Soon she had earned enough money to buy a pair of oxen. The oxen helped Harriet earn more money. Why did she work so hard? Perhaps she was dreaming of buying her freedom one day. Harriet hated slavery. like mother, like daughter. Harriet Ross was a strong woman. That's why Minty took the name Harriet as an adult. It was a way to honor her mother. Harriet's mother showed Harriet how to be brave. She taught her to stand strong for what she believed in. Rit Ross had lost 3 daughters, and when they were sold away, she wasn't going to let that happen again. Then her master had a plan to sell her baby boy. Rit hid the boy in the woods for a month. One day, the master came to her cabin. He looked very angry. Rit faced him boldly. You are after my son, but the first man who comes into my house, I will split his head open, she said. It was a standoff. Neither the master nor Rit backed down. Finally, the master left. He gave up plans of ever selling another of Rit's children. Marriage. Around 1844, Harriet married John Tubman, a free man. Because Harriet was still a slave, any children she might or would have had would be owned by her master. The children would be sold or given away. When the master died in March of 1849, Harriet knew she would be sold and could end up further from the north. Harriet decided to make a break for freedom before it was too late. Then she learned that John was not planning to join her in the north. He had met and married a free woman and was staying in Maryland. As Harriet made her way through forests and fields and on alone, she was met by kind men and women who helped her move from one safe place to another until she was in Pennsylvania in freedom. In Philadelphia, she got a job as a dishwasher and met abolitionists, or people who wanted to end slavery. The abolitionists told her the Underground Railroad worked to help slaves escape to freedom. She put her mind to freeing family and friends. From 1850 to 1860, Tubman returned to Maryland many times to rescue slaves and lead them along the railroad. Chapter 4. Harriet Tubman, the later years. In 1859, Harriet bought a small home in Auburn, New York. She moved her parents and other family members there. Harriet was always worried about money. She decided to earn money by giving speeches. She spoke at women's rights meetings and at anti-slavery meetings. She called herself Harriet Garrison to avoid the slave catchers. After the war, Harriet retired to Auburn, New York, and in 1869, she married Nelson Davis, a war veteran. Although Harriet was well known and respected for her work, she was very poor and close to penniless. Harriet never got back pay for all her spying during the Civil War, but she got a widow's pension as the wife of Nelson Davis. Then in the late 1890s, she got a Civil War nurse's pension. Harriet continued to do good works. She donated a piece of her land to build a home for the aged near her house. In her last years, she worked for women's rights until her death at age 90. Honoring Harriet Tubman. In 1944, during World War II, a Liberty ship was named for Tubman. It was the SS Harriet Tubman, the first ship named for a Black woman. The U.S. Postal Service made a Harriet Tubman stamp in 1978. In the 1990s, Harriet's brick home in Auburn became a historic landmark and as a visitor center on the land. In 2013, the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad Byway in eastern Maryland opened. Visitors travel the route to see important places from Harriet's life. Harriet Tubman was a tiny woman who grew to be a mighty warrior. Her stories of courage continues to inspire people in the United States and around the world. Boys and girls, if you would like to learn more information about Harriet Tubman, here are a few books that you can check out at your local library. Also, if you want to learn about the Underground Railroad, here are also some more books listed, and the places in which Harriet Tubman grew up and resided in was Harriet Tubman home in Auburn, New York, Birthplace and Museum, Cambridge, Maryland, and where the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center is in Cincinnati, Ohio. Boys and girls, I hope you enjoyed this book. I hope you learned something about slavery and the Civil War and how America fought against America during the Civil War and what it took for us to be free as Black people, white people, brown people, all people. It takes a lot, boys and girls. And no matter how big or how small you are, you can be a warrior. If you put your mind to it, you can do it. With that being said, boys and girls, don't forget to take the AR test at the end of this book. And as always, till next time, bye-bye.